and while other colleagues are joining as well. Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Thank you so much for joining in this yet another session from Lucilatech about the modernization and digital transformation in parliaments and legislatures. It's my pleasure to welcome this very interesting panel today about the possible applications of artificial intelligence in Hansard and the automatic transcriptions and other services that are specifically for this legislative service. Today, I have the honor and the pleasure to welcome Mr. Brahma Mishra from Meetmonk, Dr. Fotis Vitsilis from the Parliament of Greece, and also Mr. André Galvão from the Chamber of Deputies of Brazil to participate in this discussion. Today, as you notice, we are trying a new format. Instead of having a webinar and the audience just watching without much interaction, we decided to put you in the same room. Our goal is to make the time for the audience to bring comments, bring questions, and actively participate in these discussions instead of just this moderator posing the questions. I'd like to invite all of you to bring your considerations as well. In regards to the format, I'll invite each one of our colleagues here in the panel to make a opening presentation of 10 minutes. Then I have prepared 2 questions myself to bring to each one of them, which they are going to use 5 minutes each to respond. And then after that, we're going to open the time for colleagues in the audience to pose their questions and comments. For that, please, I just ask that you don't open the mic. You can raise your hands on the option here at Zoom, and I will recognize you for your question or comment. So without further ado, allow me to start our considerations today with you, Fotis. As the opening presentation, I am aware that you are researching this topic. So, actually, before that, allow me to invite each one of you to introduce yourself very briefly before we start our panel discussion today. I'll do this alphabetically. Mr. Brahma, would you like to introduce yourself very briefly in 1 minute, please?
Sure, thank you. Well, this is Brahma Mishra. I am the founder and CEO of Meetmonk. Meetmonk is a kind of pioneer in real-time voice translation and the transcript creation and maintenance, updation, etc., which is very kind of aligned to the modernization requirements of parliaments all across the globe. I am based out of Colorado, USA, and yep, that's pretty much about me. I'm pretty excited to partake in this panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Brahma, for your introduction. Fotis, would you like to introduce yourself to the colleagues as well?
Sure, thank you, Luis. Thank you for the invitation, dear friends, dear colleagues. This is Fotis Vitsilis from the Hellenic Parliament in Greece. My day job is a parliamentary researcher, and apart from this, I have some other hats, such as being lecturer and a scholar for parliamentary science around the globe. And together with Luis, we try to do our best to push forward in this really exciting field. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fotis, for your introduction. André, would you like to introduce yourself to us as well? You can do that in Portuguese, of course.
Muito obrigado pelo convite para participar desta reunião. Eu peço desculpas porque meu inglês não é fluente, mas eu entendo bem inglês, só não falo, uma falta de prática, mas eu vou tentar me comunicar e passar uma mensagem para vocês sobre a minha experiência no Parlamento Brasileiro. Eu sou taquígrafo, revisor de plenário na Câmara dos Deputados há 27 anos, trabalho na área de inovação também, lá dentro do Parlamento, e atualmente também sou membro do Sindicato dos Servidores do Poder Legislativo e atuo nessa área também de inovação e tecnologias no processo legislativo, representando o nosso sindicato de servidores. E agradeço a todos aí pela compreensão, por eu não falar inglês, mas eu vou tentar me expressar o melhor possível.
Thank you, André, for your considerations, your opening introduction. As I was saying before, Fotis, allow me to invite you to open with your presentation and your considerations. As I was saying, I know that you have been researching these topics, specifically those that we are going to discuss today. So with the rise of AI-powered tools like automatic speech recognition, how can parliaments or legislatures effectively leverage these technologies to optimize the answer production process while ensuring accuracy, accessibility, and the compliance with parliamentary procedures and rules? Fotis, please feel free to use your 10 minutes for your presentation. Also, if you wish to share your screen, you are enabled to do so.
Thank you very much, Luis. I will go a step back in time. Probably this very topic that we are discussing today, if I'm recalling correctly, the era roughly 2 decades ago was one of the first things, one of the first fields of parliamentary, let's say, operations, where we discussed the possibility of introducing artificial intelligence to somehow support the parliamentary experts' work, so the professionals that already work in the parliament. So we are talking here about 20 years ago. Back then, there was no generative AI, of course, but there was indeed quite well-developed machine learning algorithms, and they were pretty well trained, let's say, to be sufficiently error-free for providing business solutions in the area, in the organizations regarding speech to text recognition. So back then, in specific, in my case here in the Hellenic Parliament, it was 2007. So back then, I tried to work together with colleagues from a research center that it's called Athena. You can Google this. It's one of the biggest research centers in Greece, and they have a specific institute that was that had just developed a solution for speech to text in Greek. So it's a thing, of course, doing it in English, where you have, let's say, sufficient big corpora where you can train these kinds of models. And it's another thing to do it in smaller languages, of course. And since we are debating here, I'm opening a small parenthesis, this issue not in the context of the English-speaking parliaments, but in the context of global parliaments, and where smaller or bigger languages apply, we should take this into account. So these kinds of models were back then pretty well developed, even for smaller languages, so that they could produce in early tests quite good results outside the parliament. So, and they existed already as a business solution. So people in legal offices or in any kind of businesses could take that, or as a private individuals could purchase these kind of licenses, install it in the personal computer. So processing power that was necessary was rather moderate. So 20 years ago, it was even less demanding than it's today. And it worked. So the discussion was, okay, since this works, so the research question was, or the hypothesis was, what would it take to take this business solution, but it's, let's say, mature, and it is sold out there? What would it take to take it and place it and test it and in the parliamentary environment. And this is exactly what we did. So we worked with the colleagues together, and we made a pilot. So we tried to apply these kind of solutions already very early in the parliamentary workspace. And what I would like to share with you today is the results. So I'm not going to go through the steps because it was a fairly long process and very detailed process, since nobody knew what to do. We were exploring new ground, and I'm going to skip to the findings roughly a year and a half later. So it was maybe late 2008. So what we did found is the following. First of all, we figure out that it was very difficult to apply these speech-to-text solutions directly in the plenary. And the reason back then again was that the noise, the surrounding noise, the environmental noise was too high. So the quality of the let's say of the raw sound was not optimal. So it was not a booth where you speak to a microphone and something comes out. So we sort of circumvented that. So by taking, let's say, this material that was originally spoken to a booth, and some third person spoke then with clear voice to the microphone. So it's, let's say, it's a second step, preparatory step, and this produced indeed very good results already back then. But then we had another problem. You know, everybody that works in parliaments and knows already, with a few, even with a small experience, that the sound that is produced only is not the only thing that needs to be captured. And this is not for a sole parliament. This is, if I'm not exaggerating now, for every single parliament. So that the people that are transcribing directly, the stenographers that are doing this job, they do not only capture the speech with a low redundancy, thus speeding up the and lowering the volume of the written text with signs. They also, this is why it's not only one. There are multiple persons in the room at the same time. They are also responsible, at least in our case back then, and still now, for capturing any signs. So if somebody raises his hands and says, or just doing some sign, they are responsible for capturing this sign. Or if people from other parts of the parliaments, from other caucuses, speak in between, and this is already audible, they are also responsible for catching these phrases and putting them into record. And if this happens at the same simultaneously, this is why there are multiple stenographers there. They're responsible for trying to catch as much as possible, actually everything, if this is actually possible. So what did happen is that we figured out that we have a suboptimal solution. So if we are speaking only for the speech to text, let's say transcription, this was already back then quite good, not perfect, but good. But you still, we were still missing the full part which includes, of course, this extra signs and languages and intermediate voices that might come up. So what we learned And here I'm putting a semicolon so that my colleagues may follow up, and I will continue later. We figured out that it was not only the IT solution that had to be, let's say, adapted or introduced into our systems. Also, the processes under which and the conditions under which such solutions would have to be implemented would need to be adapted, meaning that additional mechanisms would be necessary to be able to add to the output of the speech-to-text solution, to be able to add there also the additional material or the additional elements that are that need to be there if you want to have a full parliamentary transcript. There's a lot more to say on this, but let's keep that as a first, let's say, element to this discussion, and we will move it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fotis, for your opening presentation. André, I'd like to invite you to make your opening presentation as well in 10 minutes. So please feel free to make your considerations and to use the floor.
Eu gostaria de dizer, em primeiro lugar, que para responder mais ou menos sobre o tema, eu gostaria de dizer o que eu entendo sobre o que é o processo de registro, mais ou menos na linha em que o último orador que me antecedeu também estava falando sobre o que é o registro taquigráfico no parlamento e as etapas em que eu acho, na minha concepção, em que ele se realiza. Eu acho que é muito importante a gente dizer que, para além daquele registro que a gente está acostumado, que é o registro oficial, a publicação dos discursos e dos atos parlamentares, eu acho que é muito importante a gente discernir entre o material em que a gente está trabalhando, que não é só o registro em si, mas são informações. Nós trabalhamos com informações, com dados que dizem respeito a deliberações legislativas. E essas informações são transformadas em registro. E esses registros, na verdade, eles têm uma validade documental, oficial, e eles reproduzem atos de fala no sentido de serem ordens legislativas, de serem declarações legislativas, de manifestações que modificam em um e outro ponto a nossa realidade social. Então, a responsabilidade na transcrição é muito grande no sentido de você captar muito mais do que a mera transposição da linguagem oral para a linguagem escrita, por meio de uma ferramenta de informática que possa só traduzir a palavra, sem uma preocupação com relação ao significado, à semântica e à mensagem. Daí porque eu entendo o processo de produção do registro legislativo em 5 etapas. A primeira delas, só a primeira delas, é a transcrição, que seria mais ou menos o que a gente entende por registro documental, um registro no ambiente parlamentar, mediante a conversão daquilo que é linguagem oral em palavras, em documentos escritos.
André, só um instante. Colleagues, can you see this the subtitles appearing to you? Oh, okay, perfect.
Delayed.
Okay, perfect. Ok, perfect. Desculpa, André, porque para mim eles sumiram, mas, por favor, pode continuar.
A tradução está indo bem, Luiz? Você acha que está indo bem a tradução? Eu estou falando muito rápido.
Se puder falar um pouco mais pausado, acho que é melhor.
Tá ok. Bom, então, retomando meu pensamento, eu divido a etapa da produção do registro legislativo, o processo de produção do registro legislativo em 5 etapas. A primeira delas é a transcrição, que, a verdade, é a ferramenta que se utiliza para transformar a linguagem oral em linguagem escrita, é o que a gente chama de transcriptação, né? Ou transcrição, que pode ser usada por qualquer meio. Os taquígrafos utilizam sinais, mas hoje a gente tem o reconhecimento de voz, temos ferramentas que podem fazer essa transmutação do código, que é a linguagem oral, para a linguagem escrita. Essa primeira etapa é a materialização daquilo que foi deliberado oralmente para um documento escrito que será publicado, né? Através, depois do diário oficial e através de documentos oficiais que publicizam as deliberações do Legislativo. Essa primeira etapa, que é a etapa de transcrição, é a etapa que a gente se refere como a ferramenta de informática que nós estamos utilizando para substituir aquilo que se fazia antes através de sinais ou de máquinas, enfim. Nós estamos falando dessa primeira ferramenta, que é a ferramenta de transcrição. Mas o que é mais importante para captar a linguagem oral é exatamente a transcrição que se fala dos atos da fala, que eles envolvem aspectos para além do texto escrito. O que eu digo é que na linguagem oral, nós temos elementos de linguagem corporal, elementos de gestuais, elementos de respiração, elementos, inclusive, que trazem marcas que a gente tem que deixar inferidas e registradas no texto para a gente conseguir realizar a perfeita tradução com a maior acurácia possível daquela intenção e daquela mensagem que o orador quer transmitir ao público-alvo. Então, a acurácia, na hora do registro, para mim, envolve esses elementos. Quais são? A linguagem corporal, a entonação da voz, a utilização de gestos, balançar da cabeça, levantar das mãos, as pausas de eloquência, as interrupções para a interação do orador com o público, ou com o ouvinte, ou com o plenário, ou com o presidente, ou com o seu debatedor. Então, todos esses recursos de linguagem oral, para se ter uma maior acurácia e maior fidedignidade na transcrição da linguagem oral para a linguagem escrita, eles deveriam ser, na minha modesta opinião, eles têm que ser captados pela tecnologia. E a tecnologia é capaz de fazer isso. Hoje, nós sabemos que nós temos recursos de leitura facial, nós temos recursos de compilação de dados para saber o emocional do orador, né? Então, a acurácia, ela para mim, no sentido dessa primeira etapa de registro, tem muito a ver com não só com o conteúdo das palavras proferidas e a semântica, mas também com a responsabilidade que o taquígrafo tem e que o transcritor tem de levar a comunicação, de fazer com que essa mensagem seja traduzida da maneira mais completa possível.
Yes, I would like to share my screen for a PowerPoint presentation to kind of discuss my points. Let me share the screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. So let me quickly talk a little bit about what we do. Besides my initial introduction several minutes ago, we are kind of world's first real-time voice recognition and transcript generation and the ability to update transcript. Sorry, I somehow my microphone got muted. So that's our forte. What we have developed by working with a couple of parliaments is those wonderful points that were brought up by my colleagues already is that it's not just recognizing the speech accurately and transcribing it. It's more importantly doing the sentiment analysis, understanding the tonality of the voice, a question versus a statement, and so on and so forth, and the ability to capture the ambient noise, the surrounding, everything else that comes with in a live discussion, not just a kind of a discussion in a controlled environment, the way we are doing here. Even in this scenario, we are seeing that the captions, the closed captions, are not accurate, not up to speed. They're coming up in bits and pieces, and they're very delayed. So the technology involved in this case is very complex. And to take that to a very lively parliamentary discussion scenario is the challenge increases manifold. With that, what we have is, so if you look at this is the problem. The problem is that we have the translation is manual and slow, or the transcription I meant is manual and slow. The standard models are not efficient in many languages. I'm talking about the bilingual and multilingual parliaments specifically. And the voice translation technology does not exist. So taking it a little further in ASR, when you recognize voices, sometimes not trained, somebody new speaking, recognizing the voice and possibly translating to a different language, transcribing in the same process, those are areas that are very new and definitely not matured. So that's why we have worked with some leaders in technology such as Google and AWS, Amazon Web Services, and governments, especially with the Indian government, because Indian Parliament is, God knows, like they have 22 languages. So one of the most difficult setups to effectively translate when somebody is speaking. So out of say 543 members, when one speaks a language, it needs to be translated to the 21 other languages for everybody to understand. And then the transcribers, the stenographers in the Hansard area, they struggle a lot. There are multiple groups of people to capture it effectively. And that is one, slow. Number two, is sometimes inaccuracies creep in. They take extra steps to correct those. Our technology makes it really fast, easier, and accurate at the same time. And the other important piece is fluid integration with their system so that it can be disseminated to the interested parties very quickly. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a member of parliament in India, and he was like, when I deliver a speech in a language other than English, if I deliver in English, I get my own transcript in 2 to 3 days. If I deliver in any language other than English, it takes me about a month. That's way too long to get your own transcript. What we do, we bring in the technology superiority, in which speech recognition, of course, is the first step. And our speech recognition does not need training. As long as you are articulated, your voice is not mumbled, your voice will be recognized 99.99% with 99.99% accuracy. And that will be transcribed correctly and translated further down the line, everything within like a second. We also have multilingual chat. Document, you can directly transfer documents that will reach, say, for example, I'm sending a document in English, Luis will receive it in Portuguese if the chosen language is Portuguese on the fly. I type something here in English and he will get the typed chat messages in Portuguese right away. That's the kind of technology we have developed in collaboration with the world leaders in different segments of technologies. Most importantly, we capture all the ambient information. We do not capture if somebody is raising her hand or the American Sign Languages. We do not do that. But everything else, for example, 5 people speaking simultaneously, we capture those. So this is kind of a screenshot of it. So you can choose your language, come in, and this can be in multivarious platforms. It can directly take your inputs from your desktop microphone, as long as there is a mechanism to select language, and then you speak in your language. It will capture and it will translate and show in your language. For example, somebody speaking in Portuguese, I will see in English, if my chosen language is in English, in a second, after the completion of the sentence, of course. We can do that in 80 different languages, 80 plus languages world over. And the translation is, the accuracy is almost 99% plus. The couple of other advantages is it's simultaneous, meaning 5 different people speaking 5 different languages at the same time. So the noise we just were discussing a few minutes ago, the noise also is captured. So many times I have seen parliaments come and say, if there is an interruption, if there is a lot of noise in the background, people are just banging desks and complaining about something, we need to capture that. We have some mechanism to capture some relevant information and suppress some background noise, like a vehicle going or somebody ringing a bell or something is happening. We suppress those noises, and then again, we are not 100% perfect. Like I said, even Zoom now is struggling to capture everything in detail, but we do as much as possible, as much as today's technology allows us to capture most of the information that goes on the parliament floor, including, like I said, multiple people speaking multiple languages at the same time. It captures, not only does it captures with the speaker information. So I know what Luis said in, say, Portuguese, and what Brahma said in English, and what XYZ said in, say, Greek or in Italian. And it will capture everything and show me in my language. And we also store the version of the truth correctly so that it can be translated into multiple languages at a later stage. So this is what we do. Once we capture everything, we have the ability. So this is kind of our dashboard, edit board, in which on the left-hand side, the actual audio, the true copy of the audio that actually transpired on the floor displays. When that is being displayed, on the right-hand side, the transcript, now you see with charts, with Brahma, whichever way the conversation went, that is captured with the speaker information. Sorry, can you repeat that? I could not read your transcript.
No, please continue, sir.
Okay, great. So, so what happens here is we know who spoke, what they spoke, and everything is in my language so that I understand. And we can also have a true copy, meaning whichever language is spoken with that script, that language, it is represented. And we have the ability to update also. So when we hear, when the recorders or the stenographers take it and try to process it, they can hear what transpired. I think Mr. Fortes said because of the noise, they have another actor or another person kind of recreate the same voice and try to capture. What we do here is we capture the original voice and then have the ability, and when the voice is being spoken, it will highlight those sentences. So audio to text correlation right away. And then if you want, you can click on, there's an edit button here. You click on edit and a modal pops up and you can update it. Whatever you update, say the AI has not captured one word. So you can update it and say confirm, it goes back to your permanent record. Now I have updated my transcript. I want to translate to a different language so that I can circulate among the members of parliament or public. I can just select one of the 80 plus languages from the drop down, and everything that has been captured by AI and humanly vetted to be accurate will be translated to a different language on the fly within a second. So what would have taken a week or so to accomplish manually, we can do that in a second. So this is a workflow. I'm not going to go into details. Some of the KPIs we capture to make sure our accuracy is always maintained. The accuracy, speed of delivery, and everything else is maintained. So we do that. So those are the kind of three important aspects of the platform, the technology we have developed. One is, of course, cost. Cost is an important factor. At the same time, speed and accuracy are important. Accuracy is really high, and after human vetting, it would be 100%. Speed and cost are always, cost is lower and speed is, like I said, within a second and a half, it recognizes and translates and transcribes. It's self-learning. So when our AI does the transcription or translation, and somebody comes in and vets it manually, makes slight modifications because AI did not recognize as it was not in the model, it feeds back into the model. So next time that happens, the error is gone. So the accuracy keeps increasing day by day as we update it and it manually, and it feeds into the translation memory. End-to-end delivery, like I said, you come in, you install it on a parliament floor, people speak. You don't have to train. You don't have to spend hours recognizing somebody's voice, or you don't have to make it soundproof or noise-proof. You do as you would do business, conduct business on the parliament floor, day in, day out. It will capture, it will transcribe, it will give you the ability. So when you come back next day, your transcription is vetted, ready, and delivered on your desktop. Digitally or printed, depending on your process. So that's all. So I have heard some wonderful challenges and achievements from my colleagues. This is what we have done for both single language as well as bilingual and multilingual parliaments world over. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brahma, for the very insightful presentation. Well, yeah, there he goes. Before I start my questions, I see Andre is back with us. Andre, I'd like to yield the floor for you for 2 minutes for you to conclude your remarks, since it was cut off in the middle while you were talking before. So please feel free to use the floor. Again, if we can ask you to speak very slowly for the interpretation, but please feel free to share your remarks.
Ok. Voltando ao ponto que eu estava me referindo sobre o processo de registro, e eu acho que a tecnologia ela deve se preocupar com todo o processo de registro das atividades parlamentares, que são, entre aspas, encerram os atos de fala e pronunciamento do plenário, né? Então, a gente está aqui, a ênfase mais aqui, pelo que eu estou vendo das exposições anteriores, é com relação à transcrição da linguagem através de uma tecnologia que possa reconhecer os diferentes oradores, ainda que haja superposição de vozes, né? E também uma preocupação com a forma da linguagem oral sendo transmitida. E isso é muito importante para que a gente tenha em mente sempre que uma das funções mais relevantes do registrador, do taquígrafo no parlamento, é trabalhar com a informação e com a fidedignidade da fonte, com a fidelidade da fonte, com a identificação dos oradores, com a fase da sessão, ou a fase do procedimento, do processo legislativo em que se está dando aquela dinâmica do plenário, para que a gente possa aferir para a pessoa que está fora do parlamento que foi cumprido todo o rito procedimental do processo legislativo. Isso é importante, que a tecnologia também tenha a percepção de que isso é relevante, porque a informação e a fonte e a segurança das informações é hoje um valor inestimável, né? Nesse mundo de informações e de dados que a gente está vendo pelas redes sociais. Mas eu queria fazer ressaltar que essas 5 etapas, além da transcrição, a gente tem a revisão, porque a gente tem que transformar esse texto em um documento publicável. E, na verdade, esse documento ele tem valor, ele tem um valor legal que não pode ser subestimado. Então, a transcrição ela tem que ser modulada em texto escrito formal, sob a tipologia de um discurso parlamentar ou de uma formatação que transforma aquilo que foi debatido em redação final de um ato legislativo, de uma lei. Então, a tecnologia também pode nos ajudar nessa transformação, como já estão fazendo, por exemplo, pareceres de consultorias legislativas do orçamento, legislativas, enfim. A tecnologia também pode nos ajudar nessa segunda parte, que é a revisão do texto e a transformação dele num documento. A terceira etapa também, que eu acho que a tecnologia deveria se preocupar, é com relação à adequação regimental, que é a identificação do momento em que aquela fala se deu, de quem é o protagonista daquela fala e se ele tinha, naquele momento de fala, legitimidade para proferir aquela manifestação. E eu acho que essa adequação regimental é muito própria dos parlamentos, porque nós estamos tratando de documentos oficiais e não só de um diálogo coloquial ou informal em outro ambiente, que não um ambiente oficial. A quarta etapa é a publicação, propriamente dita. E existe um formato próprio que é previsto no regimento das casas para a publicação desses textos. Eu acho que no programa, esse programa da transcrição, a gente poderia se pensar também na tecnologia para que essa formatação já se desse de modo automático. E eu acho que a preocupação com a acurácia também tem muito a ver com a formalidade do conteúdo desses documentos que são juridicamente relevantes nas decisões do legislativo. E, por fim, é importante também que se faça uma correlação entre aquilo que se capta de tudo aquilo que é ato de fala no parlamento com a conformação de um banco de dados, que é a coleta, a classificação, o tratamento e a análise, né? Para se fazer o sumário de tudo aquilo que foi discutido, de tudo aquilo que foi debatido, dos resultados das votações, dos projetos de lei, e aí a tecnologia da informação pode ajudar também bastante nisso. Então, eu acho que, em resumo, essas 5 etapas do processo de registro, elas podem muito bem ser bem auxiliadas pelas ferramentas de informática que estão à nossa disposição, tais como essa, e que a gente já viu como exemplo do colega que nos antecedeu.
Thank you, André, for your considerations, your first-hand experience as an editor of the debates and the Hansard staff in the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil. I saw here that we got a question from Vijay, which it seems Mr. Brahma already answered. Colleagues that have other questions, please feel free to raise your hand. We are more than happy to allow you to open the camera and post your questions and comments. I do have my own questions now, if you allow me. Well, my first question goes to you, André. And in implementing artificial intelligence for Hansard production or stenography production, several process-oriented challenges arise. What are the challenges of an AI process to address? First, speaker identification. Secondly, I know this is not the case for Brazil, but language differentiation, when the member of Congress is not speaking in Portuguese, for example, or even clarification of various speech segments, for example, points of order, leadership times, and other procedural points for the member to be recognized. And what are the process adaptations required for an AI implementation in the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil in this regard? You have 5 minutes, André, if you would like to start.
Eu acho que a correta identificação dos oradores, nos casos que há superposição de falas, para você saber exatamente de quem está se originando determinada manifestação, é muito importante. A identificação das diferentes fases do processo legislativo em que estão se dando essas falas, eu acho também extremamente relevante para que o público possa entender qual é a dinâmica da situação em que ele está vendo, do processo legislativo que ele está acompanhando, né? A captação também das condições ambientais, discussões que se dão fora do microfone, manifestações da plateia, manifestações de interlocuções que não estão na ordem de inscrição, o próprio gestual e o diálogo que se faz com o coordenador, isso é muito importante para que a inteligência artificial possa nos ajudar a fazer isso, né? Eu acho que o que a gente está falando é mais o que é caracterizado como os atos de fala, eles têm que ser caracterizados muito mais como uma complexidade de manifestações verbais que dizem respeito a efeitos de sentido, linguagens corporais, captação de ordens que não são só discursivas. Todo esse ambiente e a dinâmica do plenário que estão dentro aqui do enredo dessa... Então, eu acho que o desafio maior da inteligência artificial é fazer com que as pessoas que não estão presentes naquele ato, naquele plenário, consigam captar a mensagem daquele ambiente, naquele momento discursivo e naquela fase da sessão. Então, eu acho que a consignação em tempo real dessas interrupções, do andamento do trabalho, os argumentos de questões regimentais levantadas no bojo das discussões, a aferição, por exemplo, do rito procedimental que está aplicável àquela determinada manifestação, a classificação da manifestação, por exemplo, se o orador está falando pela ordem, para proferir um parecer, para levantar uma questão de ordem, ou se ele está querendo fazer um encaminhamento, uma discussão. Eu acho que isso é aferível e pode ser registrado à medida em que a inteligência artificial ela possa captar quais são os sentidos daquela mensagem na dinâmica do plenário em que ela está ocorrendo, né? Por exemplo, manifestações não regimentais, expressões não regimentais que, por exemplo, não podem ser publicizadas. A inteligência artificial é capaz de captar isso e retirar das notas no momento em que elas aconteçam. E eu acho assim, é importante que a gente tenha junto com essa captação, mais com relação à acurácia, eu acho que a gente tem que ter mais do que a identificação da voz, a gente pode usar recursos de identificação facial para saber se aquele orador é mesmo aquele que está falando e que tipo de mensagem ele está produzindo com o rosto. Os improvisos e as leituras podem ser também captados com facilidade e a conferência entre o que está escrito e o que está sendo falado, por exemplo, pode ser aferido pela inteligência artificial, a identificação dos responsáveis pelos registros, os efeitos de sentido, humor, ambiguidade, ironia, enfim, eu acho que isso daí pode ser um desafio que a inteligência artificial ela vai ter que enfrentar para que a gente tenha essa exata captação da realidade, da dinâmica dos trabalhos do processo legislativo nos parlamentos.
Thank you so much, André, for your considerations. Fotis, would you like to share your thoughts on this question as well?
Yeah, sure. So let me elaborate a little bit upon this has directly to do with what I was explaining earlier. What I see here to be the biggest problem currently. It appears that the very question we're trying to solve today or to tackle today is very closely related to the timing of implementation. So if we're debating in principle the biggest challenge that we need to tackle currently, I would say it's not the technology that bothers me. It's the integration in any specific use case scenario. So even if a parliament has solved it by consensus, let's say, of the stakeholders that are involved in the process, let's say the manual generation or transcription or stenographic work. This does not mean that even a similar parliament will can simply copy paste the solution, and this is why the second part would be missing, which is the process adaptation. So to put the long story, to cut it short, I would say that the technology is pretty much, well, if not mature, as our colleague said, it's progressing at a normal pace, and it has excessively tackled and very quickly tackled most of the challenges that are there. I would be more worried about the stakeholders being on the same wavelength, because in our case, and I'm talking now about the Hellenic Parliament, we managed to introduce such a solution in times of huge crisis within the COVID crisis, but 10 years more, 15 years after our original discussions and attempts to solve this problem. So 15 years, the technology matured and became what it is now, but at the same time, the workforce, the stakeholders matured as well. They understand now that technology is here to help, but this can only be the case if employed correctly, within guidelines, within guardrails, with a proper framework. And this is exactly what the stakeholders should immediately discuss or start discussing in any parliaments, not only for the sake of automating this process, the stenographic, let's say, process, but every process that has a potential to incorporate artificial intelligence elements.
Thank you so much, Otis, for your considerations. Brahma, would you like to share your thoughts on this question as well and close this round?
Absolutely. So I also will try to answer a couple of questions that were posed to me. So
actually, we have a list of people that are we are going to allow them to open the video and pose the questions. So
okay,
no worries about that.
Oh, okay. Good to know. So yes, so absolutely, I agree with the consensus here that only technology is here to help us, aid us, make our life easy. It will not replace the human intervention. That is critical, because we have made leaps and bounds in technology in last several years. However, it is not in a position where you can drive a car all by yourself when you are sleeping in the back seat. It will not understand 100% of what you are saying as a human brain would. It will not understand every single aspect of human emotions, human temperament, human sentiments, and human body language. Those are the complexities that we are yet to solve. But that, again, having said that, it doesn't mean we are helpless as far as the use of technology goes. It has made so much progress, and we have tested our model, our platform with hundreds and hundreds of people from various languages, not only in English or not only the highest spoken languages like Hindi or Mandarin or Spanish. Like these 3 or 4 are, including English, are probably the most spoken languages of the world. We have also tested with very little spoken languages, some of the very restricted or very localized languages as well. As long as we have a model to cater to different tonalities and different language expressions, we are able to faithfully not only recognize, not only transcribe, but also to translate into multiple languages at the same time. So the technology is promising. It is futuristic. I call it a Star Wars technology, if you understand my Star Wars reference. Yeah, a time will come in which, it will be entirely universal. For example, just I'll digress a little bit. Just last week, I was presenting to a state government in India, and they were like, do you speak Garhwali? It is a very, very narrowly, it's spoken by people. It's a super localized language for which we do not have models yet. But as soon as we have the model, they will be mainstream. They can speak to anybody as if they are speaking to their language. So as somebody said, I'm forgetting who the original the quotation came from. It's like, if you speak a language, if you speak in somebody's mother tongue, it will approach not their mind but their heart, and you become friends forever. They will emotionally connect with you. That's what we are trying to achieve here by language translation. And on the other side, the transcription that will understand people's voice, what they're speaking, what the tonality and the emotions, and will capture very quickly so that the whole process is faster, of course, with human intervention in the loop. And that's the reason why what I was trying to show you is it will do 99% of work for you, but you need to review and make sure a couple of changes are made whenever and wherever they are needed, and then you're good to go. It will save you time, it will save you cost, it will make you more efficient, but it will also not replace human in the loop, from the loop.
Thank you so much, Brahma, for your considerations. I have a list here of people that wish to be recognized. First is Mr. Federico Fernandez from the Senate of Argentina. Federico, please feel free to use the floor and pose your question in 1 minute, please. And if you have a specific person in the panel that you wish to direct the question, please feel free to direct the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis, and thank you very much for this amazing panel of professionals. You can hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, okay. I work as director of Parliament Modernization of Chamber of Senate in Argentina. My question is for Mr. Brahman. If the speech-to-text part in voting record could artificial intelligence be applied in the use of specific words such as roll call votes, plenary session, or majority or minority opinion as well. Also, or as for the word of committed, when majority or minority opinion is obtained. Is there any possible to translate this word?
Yes, Federico, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so what happens is we recognize not only just the voice and the content of the voice. As I was showing you on the screenshot, we have the ability to recognize and capture the speaker as well. And how do we do? We do it in two ways. One, if we have the voice, like your voice is already recorded on our database, we know it's you who is speaking. Even though, say, you come down with cold and your voice slightly changes, our AI still recognizes to certain degrees. The other option is when you do not have it in the database, many times it's not possible, then we recognize from the location from which it's coming. Generally, the members of parliament have a specific location, a seat from which they speak. And especially in multilingual setup, there will be a kind of a, when they speak, there will be a microphone there and some identification as to, okay, this is me and I want to hear in English, I want to hear in Argentine, or I am here to I want to hear in, say, Portuguese, Spanish, and so on and so forth. When you recognize or select an option for a language selection or your own identity, it is captured. So it knows location 1 is Federico, location 2 is Luis, and so on and so forth. So you just say yes or no to a question for majority minority opinion capture or voting or whatever. It knows from your location it to capture a yes. That means Federico has put a yes as a vote and Luis as no as a vote, and it will capture. So the result is the moment you are done speaking and all will be voice vote, within like a millisecond, the results will be out with full accuracy. So that's what AI does.
Thank you, Brahma, for your answer. I'm not sure if Fotis and Andrea wish to share their comments on this.
Well,
Fotis?
yes. Well, it's a very specific question. Modern software, we have tested a couple of business solutions are now able to do speaker recognition. So it's that's not the technical obstacle. For the voting process, though, I mean, probably one does not want to mix two different things. Probably there's one system that captures the speech to text, let's say, transformation, so that you have the transcript, and then the voting and the sentiments. And this is another issue that is probably not necessary for this particular use case. So I would like to separate in this particular, let's say, in this moment, I would like to separate the different use cases. This is important because the parliament has hundreds of different use cases, and if one wants a specific solution, one should probably focus on having a solution that does a very specific or tackles a very specific problem. And if, of course, this can solve other issues, this is nice to have, but it should not be, let's say, mixed together. I hope this is clear.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Fotis. Andrea, would you like to comment on this question as well?
Yes. Apenas para dizer que lá na Câmara dos Deputados, a gente já utiliza alguns recursos dessa tecnologia para reconhecimento mesmo de voz, a gente tem já. Nós temos até recurso também para a gente fazer a sumarização, mas o que é importante dizer é que, que realmente são tipos diferentes de captação, dependendo da dinâmica e da fase em que está se dando a sessão e daquilo que você quer captar e transferir para o registro. O que eu acho é que a gente precisa... a tecnologia realmente ela tem que ser aplicada para fazer isso de modo auxiliar e o mais rápido e o mais em tempo real possível, para que a gente consiga com que o parlamento tenha uma maior, como se diz, uma maior aderência do telespectador, daquele que está sendo administrado, para que a gente consiga confiar nas informações que estão sendo transmitidas através de um recurso tecnológico oficial que está sendo disponibilizado ao público, com a intervenção humana, que na verdade seria aquele que tem investidura pública para fazê-lo, mas com a preocupação de que a tecnologia consiga entregar isso de forma mais fácil, mais inteligível para a sociedade. Eu acho que é por aí, mais ou menos, isso que eu queria comentar.
Thank you, André, for your considerations. Now we have Mr. Wijay Jastri from the National Assembly of Suriname, subscriber to be recognized. Wijay, would you like to pose a question? Please feel free to share your comments, and if you have a specific question to a member of the panel, please feel free to direct it. I think you're muted, Wijay.
Yeah, okay now?
Yes, perfectly.
And thank you, Luis. It's a pleasure always to be here on this panel and discuss all about this interesting stuff. My question or my concern is to Mr. Brahma, because I asked that question before, and the answer was that we don't need to train AI for voice recognition. Now how it is being done is manually, right? Our colleagues recognize the voices of the MPs and then they make the transcription. But how will that be done if we don't train AI for voice recognition to have the right transcription for the right MP? Because that's my question.
Right. So if I understand your question correctly, Wijay, it has kind of two parts to it. One is recognizing the voice without training the AI, and the second part is recognizing who spoke it, the speaker along with the content. Is that right? Yes. So to answer the first question, our AI is able to understand, like you are speaking, I'm talking to you for the first time. Naturally, my AI is not trained, but our AI will be able to capture your voice and will understand it, even though you are not. I understand that you are not in the US and your voice is not as per US accent. It's different. Like my voice is with a different accent. As long as we speak general English or general any of the 85 languages that we recognize, it will understand. So the AI has now reached to a level of maturity, a level of advancement in which it will recognize the voice without having to train for understanding the voice modulations of individual people. It will do that. The second part is a little trickier, in which you want to associate with your name so that it comes with your name as a prefix, the way I was showing on the screen. And that will not be possible without identifying you. And that identification is twofold. I was mentioning while answering the previous question of Federico. Then that is either having your voice in our database, which will need training, or recognizing where you are speaking from, so that if you are speaking from a parliament floor, from a particular seat, it will recognize that seat, and that belongs to Wijay, or that belongs to Federico or to Luis. Then we'll be able to our system will kind of knows where this voice is coming from, who it is coming from, and what is being spoken, and it will combine those two. It will put speaker name and somebody else. And it does that with such accuracy is that while 5 people are speaking simultaneously at the same time, you are speaking, I'm speaking, Luis is speaking, it will still recognize where it's coming from, even though it's on the same floor, even though you are sitting side by side to each other, it will recognize where it's coming from and who it is coming from, and will put against it. So that's the maturity level we have accessed. But we have to recognize the speaker somewhere, the name of the speaker in some methods. And these are the 2 methods available to us. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, partly, but still the one where he is sitting, sometimes they are not on the same place, they're changing places. And so just for me, it's important that the voice recognition must be accurate, even if he's not sitting on his seat, maybe some other places. And so that must not be a problem for the recognizing the voice of the MP.
That's a wonderful point. And no, it is not bound by just a seat number. That is more like a soft seat, like the way you say log in to Zoom today from your computer versus you go to another computer, and as long as you are logging in with your user ID and password, it recognizes you. Similarly, you can change the physical seat, but virtual identity, say your membership number is 5. Wherever you sit on the parliament floor, as long as you enter 5, it will recognize that it's you. It's not a fixed position, rather than it's a virtual recognition of your membership.
Thank you. Thank you, Brahma. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Vijay. I'd like to invite Fotis and André, if you have comments around this. André?
Yeah. Oh,
aqui no nosso parlamento, para se ter uma ideia da dificuldade em se fazer esse reconhecimento, nós temos 12 microfones no plenário. E esses microfones, eles não raro ficam abertos para todos os parlamentares, que, de acordo com a concessão da palavra do presidente, deveriam se pronunciar em ordem, mas isso não acontece. Eles falam todos ao mesmo tempo em lugares diferentes do plenário. É muito difícil essa captação. A gente tenta fazer isso através de um grupo de roteirização, que são taquígrafos que ficam observando a ordem dos oradores e ficam anotando quem falou em superposição. E aí, embora haja a captação, não há o reconhecimento de quem está falando, porque às vezes falam 8, 10 parlamentares ao mesmo tempo. Imagina-se a dificuldade em fazer a identificação, e nem sempre o sistema de som é tão acurado que se pode observar pela voz quem é que está falando e em que momento. Então, é só para dizer que a gente tem essa dificuldade aqui no parlamento, e a gente trabalha ainda com um grupo de roteirização que auxilia a identificação dos oradores quando da transcrição dos discursos.
Thank you, André. Fotis, would you like to share your comments as well?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I would like to point your attention, or everyone's attention, to an issue that is increasingly discussed within our community. Yes, we are talking here about the technology of how you can utilize it and how you can enhance, let's say, the results. And as seen, we can have already decades ago pretty exciting results. But one thing that starts to become evident is the issue of cyber or let's say security around using these systems. This is not irrelevant to our discussion. So I suppose it's less important if we are using this kind of technology for transcribing the parliament's plenary. So you will always have there some people in the loop, as Brahma already said, very nice. But I suppose the same technology, more or less, will be used or utilized in less critical situations. For instance, for capturing or for transcribing in real time some speech of an MP on the parliamentary YouTube channel or the parliamentary web stream. Then, because this is transcribed in multiple languages, there will probably not be tens of people there watching if the translation is accurate. And this might be the case when using let's say systems that are not fully controllable. And I would like to put in the discussion also this point. Back then, back in the 2000s, we were using systems that were running locally not even on our servers, locally on our computers. Currently, most of these solutions use cloud technology, use servers, powerful models, large language models that are somewhere placed in the world where the parliament has no control of. This poses considerable security threats. Well, we're NATO allies with the US, but I'm not feeling comfortable with language models being somewhere in Ohio while the debate is held in Athens. I have no control over the system. I don't know who's watching and what kind of interventions they are. So eventually, we should be talking about how to make these systems not only more efficient, but also smaller, and to be able to run locally with less power consumption, leaving smaller environmental fingerprint and so on. So these are additional problems that are entering the equation, which make this whole debate much more complex than originally is perceived by most of the players. So when we are discussing this with politicians, and these kind of parameters start to enter the equation, then from the original euphoria, oh, it's great, this kind of technology, when these problems starts to pop up, or the possibility of such issues, then people step back and say, okay, let's think a little bit what could happen if we employ these systems, we make all this effort, and it is considerable effort for all our people and the parliaments, and this start to malfunction. This is not going to be funny then. So this is why I am repeating what I said in my previous remark. It is better to stand a little bit back, define frameworks, define the conditions under which these systems are employed, put systems full in the loop, have full control of the systems, if possible, having them deployed locally. If these large language models are developed, then have people co-develop them. Our team actually co-develops such large language models in Greek, so it's not a problem to have them in local languages, and try to have full control within the parliamentary environment of the process. Otherwise, sorry guys, I wouldn't be ready to accept these kind of systems in my setup.
Thank you, Fotis, for your considerations. Brahma, would you like
Luis,
to comment?
if I may,
yes, please.
Respond
yes.
to a couple of very important, very critical points raised by Fotis, is that number one, the level of maturity, and could there be human intervention, to which we already have discussed that there could be, and there are various ways of doing it. The other important part is the cybersecurity and data integrity, if you will. So we have put a lot of stress on cybersecurity, especially because this is kind of the pinnacle of democracy for each country that we are talking about. That's the parliament, and we cannot have a margin of error while dealing with the parliament discussions, debates, information, and so on and so forth. Very, very important. Thank you for bringing up that point. I would like to point out that working with the government in a couple of areas, I'm not going to name those, but we have developed the ability to implement these systems in an air-gapped environment. What it means is that it will be like a nuclear power plant. You make it air-gapped. Nothing can come in, nothing can go out. No hacking is at all possible. No malware, nothing can get in because it's air-gapped. It's from completely separated, isolated from outside world. That's what we have developed the ability to do. Is it available in all 80 languages? Absolutely not, because this is very case-to-case basis. But yes, some super sensitive organizations do not want their discussions, like I said, being discussed in one area and the data center is in a different country, there could be government intervention. There could be the security, the spy network, the espionage network's intervention, the intelligence community's intervention. You do not want that from another country. So you need an air gap system. We do have the ability and technology to do that, as long as we can put the model of different languages in that air gapped environment. You are good to go, and it will be entirely to you. Nobody can have access to it. In absence of that, I understand that this is an expensive process to set everything up in an air gapped environment. The next to that kind of complete isolation is hardware and software isolation in a virtual private server on a cloud setup. Again, it's not 100% secure. Governments can get access to it, but anything sort of a government will not have access to it, because it is a hardware key that nobody can access. So your data is almost secured, almost entirely air gapped, but not entirely air gapped, if that makes any sense. But it will be next to impossible for anybody to get their hands on it. But that will be second to the actual air gapped environment that we can set up with a model. Absolutely nobody can have access to. Thank you.
Thank you, Brahma. Thank you, Brahma, for your comments. I see here we have 3 people that we should be recognized to pose questions. We have 10 minutes to conclude our panel. So I'll ask each one of you if you can be brief on your comments, so we have time to recognize everyone to answer all of their questions. I do have now Ms. Carmen Scarlett from the European Union Parliament. I will ask her to join the floor so she can pose her comments. Carmen, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Can you try again? It's very low.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear. It's slow, but we can hear it.
Okay, sorry. I don't know where my microphone is coming from. Sorry about that. You've already talked about my questions concerned Brahma mainly, because we have the same problems in the parliament with the speaker recognition and language recognition, and also security issues. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And we don't have a database yet for the MEPs speaking, because of the security issues, because of the cloud, and they don't agree with their voice being stored somewhere on the cloud. And I was wondering how many seconds you need to create this database of voice. Brahma.
So the first, thank you for the question, Carmen. First point is, we do not need to train to be able to recognize the voice. If that's what you do not already have, we do not.
We don't.
Correct. We don't need to train, because to train for each person, it will take anywhere, depending on what language they're speaking and how much accented they are and things like that. It could take anywhere from 15 minutes to 4 hours. I cannot say without listening to their voices, but the good news is we do not need to train. We have other ways of recognizing who the speakers are and recognizing the content of their voice with highest accuracy. So for example, you come in, I do not have your database, you speak to our system will recognize it.
Will know my name, my position.
Correct. So like I said, you'll have something, imagine it something like a user ID. Once you key in that user ID, it will recognize, and that will be like instantaneous. Assigning you a user ID, say you come in and say you for Cameron, user ID would be, say, a digit would be, say, 10. So once you enter 10, it will know that Cameron is speaking. Whatever you speak, it will recognize, and when it publishes, it will have your name against it. So it will be
Okay,
insane.
Brahma.
It will
Yeah.
take 1 minute to set up.
Thank you,
Okay.
Brahma, for your comments. Karen, allow me just to open for the other colleagues if they wish to comment as well on your question. Fotis, would you like to comment on this question as well?
Well, this is of course system specific, how it captures it, the voices. What we tested already in the market, some systems, is still they do recognize the different voices, but you still, so you have speaker 1, speaker 2, speaker 10, speaker 15, and then ex post you need just to go to the text version and identify who is who, and then just change speaker 1 with the name. So it's speaker recognition can be done ex post very quickly. So since the pitch of the voice is recognized by most systems already, you don't need it immediately to have the name. You can do this within a minute afterwards. That's not a problem.
Thank you, Fotis, for your comments. Andrea, would you like to very briefly comment as well?
Só para reforçar que realmente é muito interessante a colocação de que esse reconhecimento de voz e essa identificação do orador, ela tem que passar por um crivo interno de segurança, porque ele pode ser interno ou externo. Você pode tanto reconhecer a voz ou também pode reproduzi-la, né? Isso é um perigo, porque os dados são muito sensíveis. A gente trabalha com informação e dados sensíveis para a democracia. Então, acho que esses sistemas, eles têm que ter realmente aquela parte de segurança que a gente vem falando, porque são dados muito próprios e sensíveis para a nossa democracia. É isso que eu queria dizer.
Thank you, André, for your comments. I see now we have Enya Kanyumi from the Parliament of Zimbabwe. If you wish to be recognized, our staff is going to promote you. Maybe you can turn on the camera again. Well, in the meantime, we have Mr. Everton Silva. He is the responsible for the Senado Federal of Brazil on the implementation of the automatic transcription in the Senado Federal of Brazil.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Everton, você te incomoda aguardar um momento? Obrigado.
Okay.
Enya, please feel free to pose your question.
Okay, I was worried about, like here in Zimbabwe, we have local languages, and when our MPs use the local languages, how does it work with the AI in that first we have to translate to English the local language, and then we transcribe. If I can be assisted there, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Any of the colleagues wish to comment on this matter, on local languages or dialects that our countries might have and that might require?
Just a quick comment. Thank you, Luis. I mentioned this already. This is probably when we're talking about world's parliaments, and there are national parliaments, there might be also local parliaments, of course, so subnational. These cannot be left behind. So any local dialects need to be tackled. Essentially, what we're talking about and what we are propagating and supporting as researchers is the building of national models or large language models being able to handle local languages for very specialized solutions. So please pay attention. I'm not talking about the development of super big, complex, and totally exaggerated models that are generalistic. I'm talking about building smaller ones, open source models, small enough to be developed locally and being held and maintained even on-prem, so within the parliament, or let's say in the government cloud, if there is not such capacity in the parliament, and being able to be trained for very specialized solutions on the national language or the dialect. We think, and there's a huge research community that is working on it right now. We think that this is possible. So using even with smaller corpora, so smaller amount of smaller languages, being able to train such models to handle very specific tasks in parliament, I think this might be possible in the very near future. Hence, we could be able to tackle problems like the one the lady from Zimbabwe just tackled, to circumvent the need for an intermediate step to transcribe something in English and then using the big model or an established model to transcribe it and then go back to the national tongue. This does not make sense. I would go directly and make the extra mile to try to develop local LLMs with the ability to handle local language. Thank you.
Thank you, Fotis, for your considerations. Brahma or Andrea, would you like to comment on this topic as well?
Yes, I will be brief on this. You're absolutely right. When Fotis said, our Enya said, it doesn't make any sense to kind of jump the hoops and have one language to another and then finally publish the transcript. So, and inefficient and not good. And what we have tried to do is we do not, I repeat, today's technology, we do not have all the languages and dialects of the world. But whichever we do of the 85 around languages, we do it right away, meaning, I mean, in one shot, meaning if you are speaking in, say, Portuguese, just as an example, it will transcribe Portuguese directly without having to have an intermediary language. If you are doing Italian, Zimbabwean, again, I'm making up, I do not know all the whole list of 85 languages we cater to. I cannot memorize, of course. But point is, the whole idea of developing this AI is to cater to that language right away, the model, the large language model in that specific language, and there will be no need to have intermediary translation.
Thank you, Brahma, for your comments. Andrea, would you like to share any brief comment about this as well?
Sim, eu concordo. Realmente é importante que a transcrição ela se dê na língua local, até porque há aí um problema muito grave, assim, sério com relação à forma com que você organiza os parlamentos e como as mensagens são transmitidas ao seu próprio povo. Então, acho que, pelo que eu entendi, eu concordo que tem que ser uma forma muito limitada, específica e doméstica mesmo dessa forma de transcrição sob o controle realmente do parlamento em fontes mais seguras e reduzidas, se é que eu entendi bem a dúvida.
Thank you, André. The last question of the day, and then we proceed to the end of our panel, is from the colleague of the Senado Federal of Brazil, Everton Silva. Everton, please feel free to use the floor and pose your question.
Thank you, Luis. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you for all the presentations. As Luis said, I work for the Federal Senate of Brazil. We also have a solution for transcribing audios that was developed by us. And I'd like to know your experience about maybe have any ongoing initiatives on using generative AI tools like Gemini, GPT-4 or ChatGPT to help the transcription process to lead to better transcriptions. For example, I think of a scenario where a public entity might have been incorrectly transcribed by the model, and we could use another model, another better model like ChatGPT, for example, that based on the context of the debate, of the conversation, could point out that there are some error in that transcription, some entity name was incorrectly recognized, or a person's name was not well translated. So do you have any experiences or ideas on incorporating this kind of technology?
Otis, I'm seeing you gesticulating a lot, so maybe you wish to start?
Well, yes, thank you very much, Everton, for this question. As said, no, we don't have this. We use currently in production machine learning tool that works since 2021 or so. In the midst of the pandemic, it was initiated. This works on-prem, no generative AI employed based on data that is pre-collected and trained traditionally, if one may say so, in the traditional sense of training machine learning models. And I would like here once again to say I'm very skeptical of utilizing any type of generative AI, particularly if there are models involved where you have no control of. On a personal, in my personal capacity, I use them, of course, but in my professional capacity and within the parliament, I would refrain from this unless there's a really tight framing and control. Thanks.
Thank you, Fotis. Brahma, would you like to comment on
Yes.
this matter as well?
Yes, absolutely. And the answer is no, we do not use generative AI because of two things, two reasons. Number one, I believe, and by talking to multiple parliament officials, I have gotten the information that what we need is the actual representation that was done in the parliament, on the parliament floor. So if you say something and our AI captures the wrong word or the wrong organization name or whatever it is, it needs to be corrected as is, whatever has been uttered there, a true copy, rather than making something up. And AI is notoriously, generative AI has wonderful features, no complaint about it. But many times it makes up things just in the context. We do not want the contextual representation, we want the true copy representation. That's why we cannot use generative AI, is my understanding. Number two, when we have our model that actually creates, say, 99% accuracy with one or two problems, I would not put another AI to mess things up. I would put a person, a human being, for human intervention to make it correct. That's why I'll first use AI, which we do, and then a tool to enable those corrections of inaccuracies by human intervention. That's what we do to most effectiveness.
Thank you, Brahma. André, would you like to share any thoughts on this matter as well?
Sim, eu também sou muito cético com relação à utilização da ferramenta da inteligência artificial nesse sentido da transcrição. Eu acho que ela não substitui aí a natureza humana da segurança da informação. Na verdade, é mais do que isso. Eu acho que não se pode confiar nem a uma só pessoa a segurança dessa transcrição para a realização do que a gente tem como segurança das fontes, da fidedignidade do registro, da fidelidade ao que foi realmente dito. Nenhuma pessoa só, você tem que fazer isso em revezamento, para que nenhuma só pessoa tenha acesso à totalidade da informação. São seguranças internas que não são substituíveis, até pelo próprio conceito da inteligência artificial, que a gente entende como a emulação de comportamentos humanos que são capazes de realizar tarefas e tomar decisões. Então, a inteligência artificial, nesse sentido, ela não tem que realizar tarefas em substituição ao humano, nem tem que tomar decisões com relação a essa ou aquela colocação, ou aquela palavra, ou aquela expressão. Eu acho que aí não caberia essa interface. A gente utilizaria ela como um auxílio, e não como substituição ao elemento humano, para trazer essa maior fidedignidade, maior confiabilidade na informação do parlamento.
Thank you, André, for your considerations. I apologize to the colleagues about the overdue time that we got in our panel. Very briefly, before we go, I'd like to yield the floor to each one of you for 30 seconds for a final message, a tweet, if you will, for us to close this very interesting panel discussion. I'd like to start with you, Fotis. Please feel free to share your final message today.
Thank you very much for initiating this very interesting discussion. The discussion has not closed today. We have not solved all issues, but things have progressed since roughly 20 years ago when I started working with this specific technology. There's a lot of acceptance also among the stakeholders, but I'm here referring to our last words, last question. There are issues that need to be taken into account when employing such technologies. They need to be secure. The technology needs to be secure. It needs to cover smaller languages, and it needs to take into consideration the whole debate around AI and the potential, as Rahma said, for creating hallucinations and maybe accommodating deep fakes that are not detectable. That would be a nightmare to have there in the transcriptions, in the parliamentary minutes, imaginary words by people spoken by MPs that have not been spoken. So we need to be very aware of these dangers. And then when we frame this correctly, then we can start watching and elaborating how we can solve these issues.
Thank you so much, Fotis, for your final considerations and your participation today. Brahma, would you like to share your final message today as well?
Sure, Luis. First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. It's very insightful. Hearing my same thoughts and beliefs being echoed by the esteemed members of this panel, it's heartening that people dealing in this technology, in this area, in this problem, are kind of on the same page. They have the same pain points and the same aspirations and the same goals to achieve at the end of the day. So what we have seen today with all the technological advancements, nothing can replace human intervention. So we have to recognize that technology is here to make our life easier, not to replace us by any means. So yes, so if technology can be used with the right security, with right framework, with right oversight, human oversight, then it is a wonderful tool to help us achieve things what humans would take months to achieve, technology can achieve like in 1 second. I have seen hundreds of pages of document translation done in a matter of minutes that would have taken months for human beings to do. Now technology can do that, but that does not mean humans are obsolete or their inputs are not needed. Absolutely needed. As long as humans are in the loop to have that oversight, this technology is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brahma, for your participation today and for your final message. André, would you like to share your final message with us and close this panel?
Primeiro, eu quero agradecer pela oportunidade de participação e pedir minhas renovadas desculpas por ser o único orador falando em português. Espero que a tradução não tenha mitigado ou diminuído em algum momento a minha intenção de melhor me comunicar com todos os participantes. Peço desculpas. E da próxima vez eu prometo que eu vou tentar um inglês, ainda que melhorado. Mas minhas considerações finais são que realmente a parte mais importante daquilo que nós ouvimos é que a função maior do registro é como se aqui no Brasil a gente chama de tabelionato, que é a aferição das informações que vêm diretamente da Casa Legislativa, dos parlamentos, para os administrados que não estão lá acompanhando o processo legislativo, que é um processo que tem que se decorrer de forma legal, legalizada, conforme normas específicas. Quem garante isso para a sociedade, quem garante que o processo legislativo constitucional está sendo cumprido é exatamente esses processos de registro sobre o qual nós estamos falando. E para isso, eu acho que todas as ferramentas que estão disponíveis tecnologicamente para auxiliar essa certificação, essa validade, essa fidelidade no registro, elas são bem-vindas. E é claro que existe um espaço onde a natureza humana, e não é de qualquer ser humano, é de alguém que é especificamente treinado para fazer esse registro, com a segurança que é demandada pela nossa legislação, para que a gente faça essa interface com confiabilidade à sociedade que está nos assistindo. Mas eu acredito que, sim, a tecnologia nem sempre nos dá tempo para pensar em como ela será utilizada. Às vezes nós somos atropelados pela tecnologia. Eu acredito que, sim, esse passo que nós estamos dando sobre a reflexão dos instrumentos de tecnologia que estão à nossa disposição para auxiliar nessa tarefa, ela é muito bem-vinda e esse seminário ele cumpre um importante papel para isso.
Thank you so much, André, for your final message and your considerations as well. Thank you, Brahma. Thank you, folks. Thank you all the